We actually have the instrumentation now that tells us what actually exists beyond the cosmos. I mean, it used to be thought that scientists were limited in their capacity to investigate what's within the universe. But we're now developing the tools that tells us what's happening outside the universe, what's beyond the universe. And what it's revealing is that the God that created the universe is far bigger than what any theologian or scientist had ever perceived. And so another title I got for this talk is God's Transdimensionality, how recent cosmic discoveries reveal the glory of God, the power of God, his capacity to operate beyond the dimensions of the universe and what he can do beyond those dimensions. And some of this you've already heard before. I talked about the space-time theorems that establish that any universe that expands on average, and only a universe that expands, has the possibility for physical life. Any such universe must have a beginning. Must have a beginning not only of matter and energy, but of space and time itself, and which implies that a causal agent outside of space and time that creates space-time matter and energy. Just through these space-time theorems, we can now prove that there must be something beyond the universe. You know, I took a course from Carl Sagan when I was at the University of Toronto, and his comment was, the universe is all there is or was or ever will be. These space-time theorems prove that that's not true. There must be a reality beyond the universe. There must be an agent that's able to move and operate completely independent of matter, energy, space, and time. And last evening I shared with you a comment from Alexander Vilenkin, one of the three authors of this space-time theorem. He said, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And what is that problem? A God beyond space and time must exist, who created our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. And I make a point of collecting the latest books by atheist astronomers and physicists, and the most recent books all agree with what you see from Lawrence Krauss. He's probably the most famous atheist scientist in the United States today. But what he wrote in his book, A Universe from Nothing, one cannot rule out such a deistic view of nature. Deism is on the scientific table. We can't take it off the table, primarily because of the force of the space-time theorems, but more than that, what we see in the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, this is what scientists have discovered in the past few years, but the Bible said it first. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As I mentioned last night, that phrase, the heavens and the earth, refers to the totality of physical reality. Or as it says in Hebrews 11:3, the universe was formed at God's command, so what was seen was not made of what was visible. The universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect. You know, and part of my conversion story is looking at all the different religions of the world, looking at the holy books on which they're based, the Hindu Vedas, the Buddhist commentaries, the Quran, the Zoroastrian writings. But what I found unique to the Bible is a declaration that time has a beginning and that God was moving and operating before the beginning of time. And kind of the core message of my latest book, Designed to the Core, is that before God created anything, he initiated his works of redemption. God began his works of redemption before he created anything at all. One example would be 2 Timothy 1:9. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. The grace that we all experience through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross was actually put into effect before the universe even existed, before God created anything at all. Titus 1:2, the hope that we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. Now, I was talking with a senior pastor over lunch, and he was asking me, what's the most frequent question you get? The most frequent question I get, and whether I'm talking to research scientists or young children, toddlers, this is the most frequent question I get. If God created the universe, who created God? Now, I'll bet you several of you have heard that question. In fact, can I have a show of hands? How many of you have ever heard that? Now, both of my sons asked me that question when they were 3.5 years of age. Okay? They understood that you need a God to explain where the universe came from, but where did God come from? If you read the book by Richard Dawkins, where he spews out his venom towards Christianity, that's his main objection. Christianity can't be true because you'd need something greater than God to explain where he came from. Now, what I explained to both of my sons is that there's a category error there. We're assuming that God is constrained by the same physics and the same space-time dimensionality that we're constrained to. And the space-time theorems prove that God created space and time, so he can't be subject to space and time. And actually, when the atheist or a young child asks the question, if God created the universe, who created God? They're actually presenting with a very powerful argument for creation. So what I would say to Richard Dawkins and his thousands of followers is that any entity constrained to a single dimension of time, where time can't be stopped or reversed, and we got overwhelming evidence in physics that those properties of time are true. Any entity constrained to a single dimension of time, where time only goes forward, must have some ultimate beginning or creation event along that dimension of time. But God, who created time, would not be constrained by that requirement. And one way to visualize that, and this is what I explained to my sons when they were 3.5 years of age, is that time for us is a line. Time goes forward. You can't stop or reverse time. And we all experience that. We all appreciate that time is linear. Time goes forward along a single line. But if God created time, he would not be subject to time. And when you see in the Bible that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were in relationship with one another before they created the universe, before they created time, relationship is a temporal experience. The fact that they were planning their works of redemption before they created the universe, that again is a temporal experience. So as I explained to my sons, is that means at a minimum that the God that created the universe is able to move and operate in at least 2 independent dimensions of time. So for us and everything in the universe, time is a single line. But for the Creator, we know that time at a minimum must be at least the equivalent of a plane. And in a plane of time, you could have the timeline of the universe over here, infinitely long, that never crosses or touches a timeline that God would be operating on a different part of this plane of time, where you got a length of time and a width of time. And therefore, God has no beginning, no ending, and is uncreated. Now, of all the holy books or religions of the world, the Bible stands alone in saying about God, he has no beginning, he has no ending, he is uncreated. That only makes sense if that God is not constrained to linear time. And now we got the space-time theorems to prove that God indeed is not constrained to linear time. He must have access to the equivalent of at least another dimension of time. And if he can create one time dimension, that means he can create 2, 3, 4, 5, an infinite number. It means that he is actually trans-dimensional. He's not subject to any time dimensions. Now, my sons also asked me another question. They said, Dad, you have us pray every night. How can God listen to our prayers and the prayers of everybody else that could be praying at the same time? And I said, that's a really good question. There's 7.5 billion people on planet Earth today. You could have all 7.5 billion human beings praying to God at the identical time. How does God listen to 7.5 billion prayers? It tells us in the Bible that he gives personal one-on-one attention to every prayer we utter. But how does that work? Well, I took him back to this concept of 2 dimensions of time. And I said, hey, God's bigger than these 2 dimensions. But even if we just grant these 2 dimensions, here we could have our line of time. And at this point, 7.5 billion people choose to pray to God all at the same time. But God, having access to more than one time dimension, he could choose to operate on a timeline that's exactly perpendicular to our timeline. So it's a microsecond for us would be infinite time for him. And it'd be no problem for him to give undivided 20 minutes of attention to your prayers and the prayers of 7.5 other billion people praying at the identical time. God can do all that. And that happened when they were 3.5 years of age. But one thing it did, it gave them the confidence that when they pray, God hears their prayers, that the phone lines don't get jammed. God can hear all of our prayers, even if we're all praying simultaneously. Now, astrophysicists have not only established that there has to be more to reality than a single dimension of time, they also understand there has to be more to reality than just the dimensions of length, width, and height. How many of you have heard of the Large Hadron Collider? Most expensive science experiment ever developed. It's this huge 17-mile diameter particle accelerator that runs through Switzerland and France, the most powerful particle accelerator ever built. And here's a little image here basically showing you a technician on a bicycle cycling around that 17-mile circumference particle accelerator to make repairs. Well, I know a number of particle physicists. I mean, we at Reasons to Believe have a scholar community where we engage scientists around the world. They volunteer for us in different ways. Many of them are particle physicists. Some of them are theoreticians. Some of them are actually using the Large Hadron Collider. And I've been working with these folks for over 2 decades. In fact, while I was at Caltech, there was a research group headed up by the theoretical physicist John Schwartz. And what they realized from these experiments is that there's simply not enough room within the dimensions of length, width, and height for all the symmetries required by quantum mechanics and gravity. And for physical life to exist, you need to be in a universe where you've got both the law of gravity and the laws of quantum mechanics. But there's not enough room within length, width, and height for all the symmetries that are required for both quantum mechanics and gravity. You also have others for the operation of general relativity. And so John Schwartz's research group at Caltech began to say, well, how many extra dimensions of space do we need? And it took them a couple years to figure out, well, we need at least 8, and there can't be more than 26. So it's somewhere between 8 dimensions of space and 26 dimensions of space. And it took another 15 years for them to figure out the right answer is there's 9 dimensions of space. And the fellow who's now the chairman of the physics department at Baylor University was part of that team. He's been a friend of ours, very committed Christian, worked on this particular project, and actually helped me in the writing of my book, Beyond the Cosmos. And so the picture is the universe begins with 9 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, and these 10 space-time dimensions are squished into an infinitesimal volume. And then these 10 space-time dimensions begin to expand. 9 dimensions of space are expanding. They're all expanding at the same rate. But the moment the gravity separates out from the other 3 forces of physics, and to give you an analogy, if you were to take a bar magnet and heat it up, the magnetism disappears. And what's really happening is that when you raise the temperature, the magnetic energy and the heat energy blend together to become heat energy. The same thing happens with the universe. Unified field theory. The universe starts off nearly infinitely hot. And when it's infinitely hot, you only have 1 force of physics. But as the universe cools, that single force of physics becomes 2 forces of physics. Just like when you cool a magnet, you get both heat energy and magnetic energy. And then the 2 forces become 3, and the 3 forces become 4. And these expensive particle accelerators, they've already been able to reproduce the high temperature conditions where we see the unification of the electromagnetic force with the weak nuclear force. That was done in the 1970s. The Large Hadron Collider is trying to get us on a way to understanding how the electroweak force unites with a strong nuclear force. But what John Schwartz's research team at Caltech discovered is the universe starts off with a single force of physics, and the first force to separate out is the force of gravity. That happens when the universe is 10 to the minus 43 seconds old, or when it's 1/10,000,000th of a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. That's when gravity separates out. But when that happens, you get a symmetry breaking that causes 6 of the 9 dimensions of space to stop expanding. Today, we still have those 9 space dimensions, but 6 of them are no bigger than they were when the universe was 10 to the minus 43 seconds old. How big are we talking about? Where are these dimensions? These extra 6 dimensions are wrapped very tightly around the 3 big dimensions that are continuing to expand. So if you want a visual picture, you can take a piece of paper and then wrap it up as a scroll, and that's basically where these other 6 dimensions are. They're wrapped up very tightly as scrolls around the 3 big ones. But if you wrap up the scroll tightly enough, it looks like 1 dimension and not 2 dimensions. Now the cross-section of the scroll has been determined. It's 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the diameter of an electron, which explains why most of us haven't noticed these extra 6 dimensions. I mean, if they're, a billion trillion times smaller than the diameter of an electron, we're not going to pay attention to them. But what John Schwartz's research team discovered is it's the only way we can integrate our particle creation model with our cosmic creation model. Namely, that we have to find some way to figure out how these particles are able to persist for 13.8 billion years. And basically they discovered we need these fundamental particles to behave like massless black holes. That sounds like a contradiction. How can a black hole have 0 mass? Well, if you've got 6 tiny dimensions of space, you can actually have black holes that have 0 mass. But that's the pathway to integrate our particle creation model with our cosmic creation model. But what does that tell us about God? It tells us that God is able to move and operate not only in at least the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time, he must be able to move and operate in at least the equivalent of 9 independent dimensions of space. And it can be way more than that. God created the angelic realm. That's got different laws of physics. It's got different dimensions. We don't know how many dimensions God created. But at a bare minimum, thanks to the research done at Caltech by John Schwartz's team, we know at a minimum, God must have the power to move and operate in at least 9 independent dimensions of space and at least the equivalent of 2 independent dimensions of time. So where is this God? Well, God must exist and operate both within and beyond the 1 time dimension and the 9 space dimensions. Now again, I can take you back to my late teen years when I was going through the different holy books of the religions of the world. What I discovered is some of those books describe God as transcendent. A good example would be Islam, where God is beyond the universe, but he's not within the universe. He's transcendent. And therefore, in Islam, you got the idea of a very distant God. It's not an intimate God. It's a God beyond the universe that we can never reach out or touch or have any kind of relationship with. On the other side, you got Hinduism, which describes God as being within the universe, a pantheistic worldview, where God is the universe, within the universe, but not beyond the universe. And so we have these religions that have God as transcendent to his creation or completely absorbed within his creation. Unique to the Bible is that God is both. God is both transcendent and God is immanent. And here are a couple of passages that describe that. God is simultaneously and continuously both immanent, which means able to move and operate everywhere within the universe, and transcendent, in no way limited by anything that he has created, completely beyond. And Jeremiah 23:24 states, "Can anyone hide in secret places so they cannot see him, declares the Lord. Do not I fill heaven and earth?" God is everywhere within the universe. God operates everywhere within the universe. And King David said this in Psalm 139, "If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become as night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." Meaning there's nowhere where we can go where we can run away from God or hide from God. God is closer to each one of us than we are to one another. He's everywhere within the universe, able to operate simultaneously everywhere within the universe. But there are many passages that tell us that God cannot be touched, he can't be reached. The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. He's beyond the universe. The Almighty is beyond our reach. And then what you see in the New Testament, in Timothy, God whom no man has seen nor can see. Paul and Timothy is basically telling us it's impossible for any human being to see God or touch God. And I had an atheist coming to the skeptics class I teach at my church. And he said, if God is real, why can't I see him? And why can't I see him? You really want me to believe. I want to be able to see God right in front of me. And I said, you need to think about this. If you could see God and touch God at all points in your life, would he really be God? God must be transcendent to explain why we have this universe. So if we can see him and touch him, he wouldn't be God, or he'd be much less than the God that we see described in the Bible. And the atheists agreed with me in saying, yeah, that makes rational sense. Of course, if he is God, we can't see him, we can't touch him. But the Bible also declares in multiple places, there's God for whom it's impossible for us to see or touch, yet this God is very near to every one of us. He is not far from each one of us, as it says in Acts 17:28. He's not far from each one of us. So here's the paradox. How can it be impossible for us to see God or to touch God, and yet he is physically closer to us than we are to one another? Well, to help us understand that, I brought with me this afternoon a severely handicapped couple. I want to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Flatt. Their handicap is they only have access to two dimensions, the dimensions of length and width. They don't have any access to the dimension of height. And I'm going to constrain them to a universe that has only two dimensions, length and height. So here they are in Flatland. And, when Mr. Flatt looks at his wife, what does he see? He sees a line. But if he walks carefully around his wife, he can say, oh, short line here, a little bit longer line here, longer line here. He can use his two-dimensional brain after a few minutes to calculate the outer outline of his wife, Mrs. Flatt. But as a three-dimensional being, I can look down on both of them. I not only see the outer outline, I can see the interior as well. And there's a passage in the Bible that says, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God sees things about us that we can't see and understand about ourselves. He knows us better than we know ourselves. That's one of the reasons why it makes rational sense that we put Jesus Christ in charge of our life, make him the boss of our life, because he knows better than we do what's best for ourselves. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And so, with just one dimension of advantage, I can illustrate this principle of how I can know and see things about Mr. and Mrs. Flatt that they can never see and understand about themselves. Now, if I'm above their plane, they can't see or touch me. And I can take my hand and put it 1 millimeter above their plane. I am now physically closer to them than they are to one another. yet it's impossible for them to see or touch me. I can put my hand a tenth of a millimeter. Now I'm really close to them, but because I'm above their plane, they can't see or touch me. Likewise, we can appreciate that this God that transcends the dimensions of length, width, height, and time can be physically closer to each one of us simultaneously than we ever can be close to one another. We can't see him or touch him, and yet he is very near. He understands us like we can't understand one another. Now, the only way they can come into physical contact with me is if I enter into their plane, which is what the second person of the triune God did, the creator of the universe. Humbled himself, became a human being, constrained himself temporarily to the dimensions of length, width, height, and time, entered our plane. But we could make the mistake when we read the Gospels and see all those descriptions of the second person of the triune God and think we're seeing the totality of the God that created the universe. No, we're seeing a lowered form, as it says in Philippians, a humbled form. We're not seeing the totality of the second person of the Trinity. We're seeing some of his characteristics and attributes. It'd be equivalent for me, for example, going to Mr. Flat, and I poke a finger through the plane. He comes over to investigate. What is he going to conclude about me? He says, Hugh is a small circle, because that's all he sees when I put a finger through the plane. He goes home to his wife and said, I've had this encounter with this being, and it's a small circle. Well, the next day, I go to his wife, and instead of putting one finger through the plane, I put 3 fingers through the plane. She comes over, investigates, and says, oh, 3 circles. Runs home to her husband and said, I've had an encounter, and my dear, you are wrong. It's not 1 circle, it's 3 circles. He insists that it's 1 circle. She insists that it's 3 circles. This is Saturday evening. Come Sunday, they go to church. She goes to the church of the 3 circles. He goes to the church of the 1 circle. What they weren't able to visualize in their limited dimensional frame is how there's 1 finger and these 3 fingers are all part of a single 3-dimensional closed surface. And this helps us get some understanding of what it tells us in the very first page of the Bible, where God introduces himself as Elohim. It's a Hebrew word that means the uniplural one, the one that is singular and plural at the same time. And explains why, as you read later into Genesis chapter 1, God says when he created human beings that he created them and we created them. God purposely uses a singular pronoun and a plural pronoun when he creates his human beings in the image of God. So the doctrine of the Trinity is right there on the first page. And as I've encountered Jews who insist that God is one person, only one person, a couple of responses. If God is a single person, how do you explain the origin of love? Love, by definition, requires an exchange between at least 2 individuals. Love is the receiving of a relationship and the expressing of a relationship. The real problem with strict Judaism and Islam, they have no answer for the origin of love. They also have no explanation for how science makes sense. Because in Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, you have these many gods, and they all have these different ideas and plans about creation. So in Hindu cosmology and Hindu science, there's the expectation that the scientific realm will be filled with incongruities and inconsistencies and contradictions. But when we look at the natural realm, we don't see that. We see that everything is consistent and harmonious. It speaks of a single plan coming from a single mind, and that's the doctrine of the Trinity. It's 3 persons and 1 essence. That the character attributes of the Father are identical to the character attributes of the Son and the character attributes of the Spirit. Yes, they're 3 persons able to relate to one another independently, but they have a single mind, a single person, a single set of attributes, a single essence. 1 essence and 3 persons. Now, I'm not claiming that this little analogy I gave you here explains everything about the doctrine of the Trinity. After all, it's more than just a single dimension of advantage that God has over us. But what I have done in my book, Beyond the Cosmos, is actually look at the Bible and see that it's unique amongst the holy books of the religions of the world, and that it's filled with paradoxes that can't be resolved in the dimensions of length, width, height, and time. The Trinity is something that is irresolvable. In fact, my mother, it took 30 years for her to come to Christ after I came to Christ, and she kept saying the Trinity is a mathematical impossibility. And I said, well, yes, if you're trying to explain the Trinity in the context of just length, width, height, and time, it's impossible to reconcile what the Bible teaches about the Trinity. But God's not constrained to length, width, height, and time. He created all of that. And what you see in the other holy books are doctrines that are all visualizable within length, width, height, and time. The heaven in Islam, the heaven in Hinduism and Buddhism are all things we can visualize within length, width, height, and time, but not the heaven of Christianity, not the hell of Christianity, not the Trinity that we see taught in the Bible, nor the fact that the Bible extensively teaches that God has granted us human beings free will, and we're going to be held accountable for everything we think, everything we say, and everything we do. 1,500 passages in the Old New Testament declare this doctrine of human free will. And yet you have an equal number of passages in the Bible declaring that before God created the universe, he had predetermined every thought we would think, every word we would speak, and every action we would perform. God's predetermination. And so, how do you resolve this doctrine of human free will and divine predetermination? Well, I'm going to get you started on this, but I don't have time to give you the whole answer. You will find that in 3 chapters of Beyond the Cosmos. But it tells us in the book of Ephesians that God foreknows and he predetermines. So Paul first brings up the concept of foreknowledge. And I'm going to illustrate that with you briefly. I want you to visualize not a circle here. This is a sphere, a 3-dimensional sphere. And so on the surface of that sphere, we're going to put the timeline of the universe. So that little red line there, that's the timeline of the universe, somewhere on a latitude of this sphere of time. We can put God at the North Pole of this sphere of time, and he can drop a perpendicular timeline to say several billion years in the past history of the universe, another perpendicular timeline to the present moment in the universe, and a third perpendicular timeline to some moment in the future when he decides I'm going to replace the universe with a brand new creation. Now what's interesting here is that these 3 different moments in our time that transcend billions of years are all expressed from a single instant of time at the North Pole of the sphere of time. In fact, what we can see is we can take the entire experience of time along the timeline of our universe, and we can compress it back into a single instant of time. So God, from a single moment of time, can simultaneously move and operate over the entire age of the universe, over the entire lifespan of every one of us human beings. And this illustrates the principle that Paul teaches in Ephesians, that God foreknows. He knows from before the universe was created everything that was going to happen in the course of your life, everything that was going to happen in the course of this universe. Now, what I've done in Beyond the Cosmos, in fact, we're giving away the chapter for free that gives you 3 examples where we look at what we know about God's transdimensionality and God's extra-dimensionality, and we show you 3 different ways you can completely resolve the doctrine of human free will and the doctrine of divine predetermination. And the 3 examples I give all could be incorrect. I'm simply showing you that if you allow God to be as big as what physics now proves him to be, there are solutions. This is not a contradiction like you will hear from Muslim apologists or Hindu apologists. If God is both immanent and transcendent, there are solutions. In fact, I believe that there's at least millions of solutions. But what I did is I picked 3 that are fairly easy to illustrate and put them in this chapter. I think it's chapter 13. Anyway, that's the chapter we're giving away for free. It would take me about 90 minutes to explain that in some detail. But here's the point that struck me even before I became a Christian. One of the things that's unique to the Bible, it's the only holy book in the religions of the world that declares doctrines that are impossible to visualize and resolve within the dimensions of length, width, height, and time. When I saw that in my late teenage years, I realized this book has the possibility of coming from a transcendent source, where all these other holy books I'm reading show the limitations of human visualization, which suggested to me that these other holy books were inventions of human beings. But the Bible's message had to come from a being that transcends the dimensions of the universe, because it declares doctrines that are impossible to visualize within the dimensions of length, width, height, and time. These are not mere human inventions. This is something that must have come from a being that exists and operates beyond the space-time dimensions. Anyway, you'll see this described in some detail in my book, Beyond the Cosmos, and we've actually produced a DVD, and it's really geared for children. And one of the things I found amazing is when I speak to children that are 4, 5, and 6 years of age, they get this much more easily than adults that are 50 years of age. And I did experiments on my boys when they were born, trying to figure out why is it that children seem to grasp these concepts more easily than adults. And what I discovered when my sons were born is that they couldn't tell the difference during their first few months of life between their toys, their three-dimensional toys, and a two-dimensional life-size cutout that was the same color as their toys, which told me that when they're in their womb, they're thinking in two time or space dimensions. But coming out of the womb, they get introduced to a three-dimensional realm. But I also discovered by the time my sons were 5 months of age, I couldn't trick them anymore. They knew the difference. But the fact that they're so close, at a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, from that transition from two-dimensional thinking to three-dimensional thinking, maybe that explains why children get this more easily. But let me finish my message with a description of an objection I get from atheists frequently. And that is when you read the Gospels, it tells us that Jesus spent 6 to 9 hours on the cross. And during those 6 to 9 hours on the cross, he had paid the atonement price for every human being who has ever lived. Basically took upon himself the wrath of God, the penalty from God for all the sins and offenses that we human beings have committed against God and against one another. And the atheist objection is, how can God accommodate that in just 6 to 9 hours? Yes, crucifixion is a very painful way to die, but many people have died on the cross, some taking even longer to die. With Jesus, he was dead in less than 9 hours. How can God, Jesus, atone for all the sins in that period of time? Well, I explained to him that when you read the Gospels, and especially when you read 1 John, the first letter that John wrote, it tells us that the one that died on the cross was a human being. But he wasn't just a human being, he was also God. That's the core that you see in the first epistle of John, that Jesus of Nazareth was fully human and fully divine. And yes, in his divinity, he chose for a period of time to limit himself, but he never let go of his divinity. So here we have a picture here. I want you to imagine a vector coming from behind the screen, out from the screen. So coming from behind the screen, out from the screen, that little circle there with a cross on it, that's Jesus spending 6 to 9 hours in our time dimension dying on the cross. But this is a God that's not constrained to a single dimension of time. So we can imagine that he's also able to experience time along the plane of what you see there on the screen. And that line can be infinitely long. And then we can also imagine a third dimension of time, that he could be existing for infinite time on 100 billion parallel lines of time, where each of those lines of time represents the atonement price that we human beings deserve to suffer for the sins that we have committed. And so you have there 100 billion parallel lines of time. And so we're not just talking about the creator of the universe experiencing just 6 to 9 hours suffering on the cross. Given his divinity, he could choose to suffer for infinite time on 40 billion infinitely long lines of time, and how all of this can be compressed into just 6 to 8 hours of our time frame. And this is one way, just one way, that Christ could pay for an eternity of torment for billions of human beings. Because that's what we're told in the book of Revelation, that in order to take account of all the sins that we've committed against God and one another, it would take an eternity of torment to accommodate that. That's what Christ suffered for us on the cross. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way Jesus did it. I'm just saying this is one way he could have done it. He's got millions of other options on how he could have atoned for all of our sins. But this is one way he could have done it. But it also makes the point. One reason why so many people have refused the offer of what Jesus has made available to us. He basically said, I am prepared to trade my moral perfection for your moral imperfection. We don't recognize the magnitude of what he has offered. And this is something you see in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? But the problem is, so many of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, we haven't really explained or illustrated the greatness, the depth of what Christ has offered for each of us on the cross. So I just give you this as one illustration. And hey, if you get the DVD, you can play it for somebody and let them see this for themselves. And by the way, feel free to take these table demonstrations. I made this on purpose. It's easy to cut out on a piece of cardboard these things. And you can illustrate this and use this message to communicate the depth of what Christ has offered for us on the cross. And I've actually experienced when non-Christians really begin to appreciate the magnitude of what the second person of the Trinity did for us when he died on the cross, they come into this recognition. How can I possibly ignore or reject such a magnificent gift? So with that, I'll take, I got 18 minutes for Q&A, and once again, I'll take questions on any subject that you care to raise up. But we do ask you to come to the microphones, because we are recording all of this.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ross. I have a question to you as a Canadian.
Okay. And I'm a dual citizen, so I'm both American and Canadian.
Got it. So my question is, from what you've said, as well as I've read, just reading up on Canada and its culture, is Canadians or Canadian culture is far less religious than American culture.
Oh, definitely.
And yet, superficially, the cultures are very similar. I know politically and constitutionally a lot of differences, but on the superficial level, two very similar cultures, and yet one is much more religious than the other. Do you have any insights about why that might be the case?
Well, there was a time when Canada was far more Christian than the United States. And what happened at that time is Canada said, well, we've reached all the Canadians that are going to come to Christ. We're going to take the gospel overseas. And even today, Canadian Christians are much more heavily invested in foreign missions than American Christians. But American Christians are much more involved in reaching fellow Americans for Christ. And, I tell people, I was born in Montreal, I was raised in Vancouver, and educated in Toronto, but in all cases, I was close to the downtown core. And what I've noticed about Canadian Christians is that they have created these fortress suburbs. So where I was living in Vancouver, the percentage of Christians per capita was way below 1%. But if I were to drive, and our family didn't have a car, so we never got to see this place, there's a community called Abbotsford, about 60 miles from the downtown core of Vancouver. That's more than 80% evangelical Christian. That's typical of the big Canadian cities. The Christians leave the city proper, they create their own suburb, they have their own schools, their own universities, their own hospitals. There's a church in every corner, but they're not engaging the Canadian population. And consequently, the percentage of Christians in Canada has been going down, where it's now around just 5% of the total population. And so As I speak in Canada, I tell the Christians there, I'm grateful that you're doing all this foreign missions, but there's a mission field here. Matter of fact, where you're doing the foreign missions, those people there are sending missionaries to Canada. And so maybe we need to re-emphasize or re-look at our priorities. There's a mission field right here.
Related now, does that explain the collapse of Catholicism in Quebec, which was once highly devoted, but now is...
The church is growing fastest in Quebec, because what's happening in Quebec is that people are actually reaching out, and a lot of it is foreign missionaries who have gone to Quebec and basically have targeted the nominal Catholics, the people that are Catholics in name only, and basically are preaching the gospel to them, and they're seeing a large number of people coming to faith in Christ. So things are happening in Quebec. Christianity has always been strong in Alberta, but I can tell you about half the evangelicals in Canada live in Alberta. So we need to get them spread out.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question, Dr. Ross. You showed those vectors and the billions of years sideways from one of those dimensions.
Right.
And my thoughts immediately think, well, is Christ still suffering? But when you collapsed it into that circle, because Christ did say it is finished. So I take that to mean he's not still suffering. Can you explain how those billions of, I don't know, what is it, time this way with that vertical vector does not mean he's still suffering?
Well, again, I made the point that's one way that Christ could pay the atonement price for 100 billion human beings who all deserve eternal torment because of what their offenses have done. That's one way. Another way we can think of it is, okay, maybe there's a way where he could experience that torment in a collapsed time frame. So, for example, he did die on the cross. But what of the pain and suffering experienced on the cross was 100 billion times greater than what any other human being experienced on the cross. So there's other ways of doing this. But when we talk about him suffering for a period of time, that's within our time dimension. There's nothing in Scripture saying is that he's not, paying an atonement price in other dimensions of time. There's lots of options. I'm not claiming to have the answer. I'm just saying it's not a contradiction. Yeah, it's a visual demonstration of one way that God could have done it. And I'm basically saying to the atheist, because he only spent 6 to 9 hours on the cross doesn't mean he was incapable of paying the full atonement price for every human being who ever lived. This is God dying on the cross, not just a human being.
Right.
And this is one illustration.
Right. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Ross. Quick question. That spherical graph that you showed on the possibilities of time, like a linear time for us, could you maybe talk to the verse in Revelation about the Lamb being slain before the foundations of the world? Is that kind of talking to the foreknowledge, or that kind of actually being possible that it was in our linear time, but the actual, not the crucifixion itself, because that obviously took place at a certain point in time, but in God's time it could be continuous, I guess.
Well, that's an interesting
happened, right.
statement where it says he was slain from before the creation of the world, which means that somehow he was suffering that atonement penalty even before the universe was created. How do we understand that? Well, I don't know how to understand that, because God's got a lot of options. He's not constrained to just our time dimension. And certainly we have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit at a minimum strategizing and planning this whole redemptive experience that the second person of the Trinity was going to go through. So I can appreciate it was painful for the second person of the Trinity even before anything had happened, even before any human being was created. And then we got the problem, well, what about the angelic realm? I mean, Satan was not the first sinner. Or pardon me, Adam was not the first sinner. Satan was the first sinner. So now we got the issue, well, what about all these angels that rebelled against God? There's a whole paradox of the angelic realm versus the human realm. What's going on there? And particularly today when we see all these incredible events happening on the political arena, It's like the world doesn't make sense. And what I share with people who are really concerned about politics is, wait a minute, it's never made sense. Politics has always been irrational. The wars that people have fought have been irrational. The economy is irrational. And what the Bible tells us, we don't just wrestle with flesh and blood. There are demonic forces at work. And we shouldn't be surprised that Christians behave the way they do. I mean, I run into a lot of atheists that say, I don't want to go to church. Look at the way Christians treat one another. And I said, well, given that there's a spiritual war going on between God and the righteous angels and Satan and the demons, where are the Satan and the demons going to invest their time and efforts? They're going to be going to church. They're going to be messing things up. So the fact that we see all these weird doctrines being taught in the church and people behaving and treating one another in very unchristian ways, it's like we would expect that to be the way it is. We don't just wrestle with flesh and blood. Which means we who are Christians need not to take these attacks personally. We need to realize, hey, there's more going on here. And incidentally, I'm a firm believer in 2 Corinthians 5. It tells us the world is watching us, and they'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another. That needs to be our goal as followers of Jesus Christ, to emulate a love and a care for one another that testifies to the world. So stop the backbiting, stop the name calling. And the other thing it tells me, this is not just a flesh and blood warfare. Look at what Christians divide over. They divide over the non-essentials of the Christian faith. I rarely see Christians fighting over creedal issues. We all accept the creeds. What do we fight over? How we baptize people. You see this in Acts 15. They fought over circumcision. But one of the things I've learned by studying church history, the church has always fought and divided and even had wars with one another over the non-essentials of the Christian faith. And each non-essential was aimed at keeping a particular unwelcome people group from out of the church. First century, what did they want to do? We don't want these Gentiles coming to church. Well, let's come up with a doctrine that makes it kind of unpleasant, at least for the Gentile men to come to church. And then what we see the Jerusalem Council saying, let's not put an unnecessary barrier in front of the Gentiles. Let's take that off the plate. But notice, it took decades before people started killing one another over that non-essential doctrine. And you see that in the religious wars between Belgium and the Netherlands. It's been going on. It happens in American churches today. So we shouldn't be surprised.
I got it. And then one other, maybe not a quick question, but I'll see. Is there a possibility that there is actually a multiverse? And if so, does that affect our understanding of Christology and eschatology?
Okay, the multiverse is this idea that there might be an infinite number of universes. They're all different from one another. Now, where you see some validity to that is in the inflationary hot Big Bang creation model. And I've written about this in my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, the 4th edition, basically making the point, if you got an inflationary universe, it's going to spawn multiple space-time bubbles. But only a space-time bubble that's characterized exactly like the one we're in will have the possibility for life. And so yes, there's all these other, quote, universes, and it could be a very large number. And inflation predicts that you will get a large number of a wide variety of space-time bubbles. However, in inflationary cosmology, all these different space-time bubbles are subject to the same laws of physics. So it's not like the multiverse that the atheists are proposing, where they're saying there's an infinite number of universe and an infinite range of laws of physics, an infinite range of characteristics. In inflationary Big Bang cosmology, sometimes referred to as a level 1 universe, where we have a huge number of universes, but they're all subject to the same laws of physics, and only one with a space-time characteristic, like the one we're living in, has the possibility for life. And by the way, if there was no inflation event, there would be no possibility for life. It's crucial that the universe be a certain size that it is in order for life and human beings to be possible, but it's also crucial that the universe be thermally connected. The only way you can have the universe as big as it is and yet remain thermally connected in the current era as if there was an inflation event at 10 to the minus 35 seconds after the cosmic creation event. And I explain all the fine-tuning that's crucial. And by the way, some people think we don't have evidence for the inflation. We do. We measure something called the spectral index in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Not only does it prove beyond any shadow of doubt that an inflation event happened, it's actually ruled out a simple inflation model. We now know it's some version of a complex inflation model. And give those people at the South Pole a few more years, they're going to be able to tell us exactly what kind of inflationary hot Big Bang model we're dealing with. I'm on record as predicting when that gets published, it's going to reveal to us even more fine-tuned designs about the cosmic creation event than we have today. When it happens, we'll let you know. Yes.
Hello. So, for me, when I was raised a Christian growing up, and for a little time I didn't believe for a while, but then I came back. I watched a video by a scientist called Robert Gentry about polonium halos, where it talked about the Earth being young because of the half-life of polonium within granite, and due to the breakdown of its structure, it would have to be instantaneously created so that it would only exist in that fashion because of the nuclear decay.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was a video I watched. I thought it was interesting. So I went back home. I decided to open the Bible again because I felt God calling me. And I read the Bible. This was like in 2013 or so. And I read the first chapter of the Bible. And I read it again and again. And I saw something there cosmologically that I did not see before that I thought was quite interesting, where it described the reason why the sky was blue biblically as to it being an ocean of water above us, God's throne being above that physically in the sky. So when you look at the sky, when Jesus ascended from the dead and he rose to heaven, he rose vertically to heaven, which kind of makes sense in that chapter. I guess my question is that's currently, I do believe that's the truth, as the Bible says it, from cover to cover, Genesis to Revelation. Did you ever come across that cosmology, or do you believe that at all to be the truth?
Yeah, I've responded to Robert Gentry in my book, A Matter of Days, in the second edition. And he brings up these polonium halos as a way to argue for a young Earth interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. But what he's not admitting is that there's a lot of nuclear scientists who are saying, we don't think those are polonium halos.
Okay.
And so there's a major dispute over whether these little halos he's found really are polonium halos. And what I comment in A Matter of Days is, yes, there's dispute about these so-called polonium halos, but there's no dispute whatsoever about the uranium halos and the thorium halos.
Okay.
And just using Robert Gentry's own method of interpretation would imply, and he admits it, would imply that those uranium and thorium halos mean that the Earth is billions of years old.
Okay.
And so he's taking one disputable piece of evidence to try to overcome something that's not disputed. Now, as far as his model, and it really goes back to Russell Humphreys, Gentry has kind of adopted Russell Humphreys' model that the universe was a big ball of water that collapsed and became a white hole. But the problem is, it takes a long time for a black hole to become a white hole. I mean, Russell Humphreys is right. A black hole, when it collapses, if you wait long enough, it will come down to the size of a quantum particle, and when that happens, quantum mechanics will overcome the force of gravity, and everything sucked into the black hole will become a white hole. So this is called the white hole cosmology of young Earth creationism. The problem is that it takes a minimum of 10 to the 66 years for even the smallest black hole to become a white hole. And so this isn't helpful for the young Earth model. It basically argues for a universe far older than what any physicist would argue for. Now, Russell Humphreys is right in that water is abundant in the universe. It's actually the third most abundant molecule in the universe. right after hydrogen 2 and hydrogen 3. The universe is soaking wet. But that's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that, yes, water is abundant in the universe, but almost everywhere in the universe, that water is in a vapor form or frozen form. It's rarely in a liquid form.
No, that's understood. I'm kind of referring to the Hebrew connotation of tehom, about the cosmic ocean, about heaven being above that. That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, well, what it says in Genesis 1:2 is the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters and is dark on the surface of the waters. And if you go to the parallel creation text in Job 37 to 39, Job 38 verses 8 and 9 tell us why it's dark on the surface of the waters. Because God had blanketed the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. So there it's explicit why it's dark on the surface of the waters. It's because the clouds would not let the light of the sun, moon, and stars penetrate through and get to the surface of the ocean. I think, as I said in the Q&A last night, that I run into all kinds of scientists who say Genesis 1 teaches scientific nonsense. And I say, well, from what frame of reference are you interpreting it? Well, he said, God's looking down on the earth. I said, that's not what the text says. The Spirit of God is hovering on the surface of the waters. From that frame of reference, you've got God looking up at the clouds, not down on the clouds. And from that frame of reference, everything stated in Genesis 1 is correctly described and in the correct chronological order. It's not teaching scientific nonsense. It's teaching a science that was far beyond the science of Moses. And I see that as evidence. This book has predictive power. It was predicting scientific discoveries far beyond at the time that the text was written. And you may be referring to other young earth models, these canopy theories that there was water above the earth. Well, if you read the young earth literature, they admit they can't make any of their canopy models work. The law of gravity either causes them to completely dissipate or collapse. And I cite that in my book, A Matter of Days. And basically, this is an argument that shouldn't even be raised. Because when you look at Genesis chapter 1, you can see right there in the text that the Hebrew word day has at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are used in the text. Creation day 1, the word day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, season, days, and years. That's day is 24 hours. Genesis 2:4, it uses the same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. And as I mentioned yesterday in the Q&A time, you got an evening and a morning bracketing the first 6 days, telling us that each of those days has a start time and an end time, but there is no evening and morning for the 7th day. And both Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4 state we're still in God's 7th day. So the 7th day must be a significant passage of time. And it's that time when God stops creating. And in the human era, we see no scientific evidence for creation miracles, but we see it everywhere before humanity. Explains why so many astronomers are Christians and so few biologists are Christians. And also tells us in Genesis chapter 1, God created both the human male and the human female on creation day 6. But if you go to Genesis 2, God creates Adam first outside the Garden of Eden, puts him in the Eden. He watches the trees grow. He works the garden. After working the garden long enough to realize there must be more to life than gardening, God says, I want you to name all the nephesh animals, the animals that are not just physical, but also soulish. He engages them, gives them an appropriate name, and what does the text say? He looks down on Adam and realizes Adam is lonely. And so what does he do? He puts Adam to sleep, performs surgery on him. Adam recovers from the surgery. The word you see coming out of Adam's mouth when he sees Eve is hapa'am. It's used more than 20 times in the Old Testament, consistently translated at long last. And so the events of day 6 must be longer than 24 hours. So I see no biblical reason for this young earth, old earth debate. It's not a scientific debate, it's a biblical debate, but I think the biblical debate is easily resolved. And the principle here is we need to look at all the creation texts in the Bible read all of them literally and consistently, because Hebrews cannot contradict Genesis. Isaiah cannot contradict Genesis. So look for that interpretation that's consistent with all the creation text.